Hello, my dear friends. They didn't have showers, toilet paper, or even soap as we know it today, and yet Japanese women in the Edo period were some of the cleanest people in history. While much of the world was bathed in stench and perfume to mask their filth, these women developed a system of hygiene based on quiet habits, folk remedies, and daily discipline. No machines, no chemicals, no shortcuts. What did they know that we've forgotten tonight? We'll step into a world of steam, clothes, and secrets to discover how they kept themselves clean in a dirty age. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you imagine Edo women started their day with warm towels and gentle soap, that picture would be far from reality. In most homes, the first task after waking up was to head toward the corner where a ceramic water jar stood waiting. This jar, often the same one used by generations, held cold water from the previous day, either drawn from a nearby well or carried from a river. It was not heated, not filtered, and certainly not perfumed. The water inside was simply water. The woman would kneel beside the jar, lift its wooden lid, and scoop the top layer of water into a small wooden basin using a ladle carved from bamboo. There was no rush. No one timed this. It was done slowly, without talking, because there was nothing to say. A soft piece of cotton cloth, folded neatly the night before, would be picked up, dipped into the basin, wrung out, and pressed to the skin, the forehead, the cheeks, the chin, then the neck, always in that order. Not for beauty, but because it was how it was always done. There was no mirror. Few homes had one, and even if they did, it wasn't part of the morning routine. The cleaning was done by feel. The cloth was wiped gently, but not lazily. Too rough, and it would irritate the skin. Too light, and the sweat from the night wouldn't come off. After wiping, the cloth would be rinsed in the remaining water, wrung out again, and hung over a hook in the kitchen to dry. Calling this a skincare routine would be like calling a hand fan an air conditioner. No one used soap on their face. Soap was rare, made from ashes and oil, and mostly reserved for laundry or greasy dishes. Using it on the face was wasteful and unnecessary. Instead, some families, especially those who cooked rice often, saved the cloudy rice water. This was kept in a separate jar and used in the morning. It had a slightly smooth texture and left the skin feeling soft. Mothers told daughters that it kept their faces pale and clear. That was enough reason to continue the habit. The water, especially in colder months, was sharp and biting. There was no heater in the house, only the warmth from a charcoal brazier. Heating water meant starting a fire, so most women simply accepted the shock of the cold. Their hands would turn red, their sleeves damp at the cuffs, but the task had to be done. A clean face was the sign of a proper woman. Even young girls, barely old enough to carry a bucket, were taught to rinse their faces before breakfast. This action was not glamorous, but it was important. In a world where personal image was tightly tied to household reputation, being seen with an unwashed face could reflect poorly on the whole family. No makeup was needed, just a clean face and a tidy hairstyle. It's not so different from how today's routines revolve around making yourself presentable for the outside world, just with fewer products and more patience. The clothes used were always white or undyed. They were washed every few days, by hand, with water, and maybe a touch of leftover soap from dishwashing. Drying was done under the eaves, away from where guests might see. Women kept a separate set of face cloths from those used for other cleaning. Mixing them was seen as careless. In bigger households, several women shared the same space for washing. The eldest usually went first. She would finish. pour away the used water into the garden, and prepare the basin for the next. The clothes were personal, but the ritual was shared. Quiet cooperation, no talking, no fuss. There was no fragrance involved. The only scent came from the wooden ladle, slightly musty from years of use, and the faint smell of damp cloth. Still, that clean water on the skin gave a fresh feeling. Not refreshing in the modern sense, but satisfying. The feeling of doing what needed to be done. I always find this kind of quiet routine strangely grounding. There's something about doing the same thing each morning, with the same tools, in the same space, that makes you feel steady. After wiping her face, the woman would not linger. The cloth would be hung, the jar would be closed, hair would be combed, then tied, clothes would be layered one after another. Then breakfast preparation or floor sweeping began. The face wash wasn't a moment of relaxation. It wasn't treated like a break or a reward. It was one step in a long day of steps. Missing it would be like skipping shoes before going outside. Not because anyone would scold you, but because it just wouldn't feel right. In some families, especially in the countryside, they added a pinch of dried tea leaves or crushed leaves into the water. This wasn't common, but for those who did it, they believed it helped keep the skin calm. Still, it was never fancy. No creams, no oils, no perfumes. That came later, if at all. Children watched and copied. A girl of 5 was expected to at least rinse her cheeks. By the time she was 10, she knew how to prepare her cloth, fold it neatly, and squeeze without spilling. Mothers didn't give long lectures. They just showed by doing. This kind of care, small and consistent, helped shape how women carried themselves for the rest of the day. They might wear the same kimono all week, but their face in the morning had to be clean. Next, we'll step into the wooden bathing rooms of Edo homes, where tubs were shallow, steam was rare, and cleanliness meant something very different from comfort. Once the face was wiped clean and the morning chores were done, most Edo women would not think about bathing until the end of the day, after cooking, cleaning, folding clothes, and finishing any work in the garden or home. The final task was to prepare the bath. This was not a long soak in hot water or a luxurious ritual. It was a short, quiet wash using a small wooden tub in a corner of the house, often behind a curtain or in a side room with a wooden floor. The water used for bathing had to be heated on a fire, usually the same fire used for cooking dinner. When the food was finished and the flames were still hot, a large iron pot was placed over the embers to boil water. Once warm enough, the water was carried carefully into the bathing space, usually in a wide-mouthed bucket. It was then poured into a shallow tub made of cypress or cedar. These tubs were small, not deep enough to sit in. Most women bathed by kneeling beside them, using a ladle to scoop water over their bodies. There were no bathrooms as we know them, no tiled walls or drains. The floor was wiped afterward to prevent dampness. The tub sat directly on wood, and a small cloth was spread out nearby to hold the soap substitute, usually a pouch of rice bran. There was no expectation of steam, no candlelight, no scented oils. To call it a spa experience would be like calling a wooden cart a luxury sedan. Most women did not use any kind of soap. Soap was reserved for laundry and hard scrubbing, not for the skin. Instead, they filled small cloth bags with leftover rice bran, which they used to rub gently across their arms, shoulders, chest, and legs. The bran helped lift dirt and oil from the skin. It left a faint powdery smell, nothing strong or perfumed. If a woman had access to dried leaves like mugwort or shiso, she might crush them into the bag for added scent or to soothe skin irritation. The bathing process itself was simple. She sat on a low stool, dipped the ladle into the warm water and poured it over herself, starting with the shoulders. Then she rubbed her body slowly with the rice bran pouch, rinsed, and repeated where needed. There were no mirrors, no exfoliating tools, no shampoos, just hands, water, cloth, and heat. Hair was usually not washed during these baths. It required a separate process, more water, and more time. The evening bath focused only on the body. Many women wore their hair tied up, especially if it had been dressed earlier in the day. Untying it just for a quick wash was not practical. The water in the tub was not changed after one use. In homes with more than one woman, the same water was shared. The eldest bathed first. Each person added a little more hot water to adjust the temperature. Cleanliness was maintained by rinsing before entering and using the water only for pouring, not for soaking. Compared to modern homes where everyone expects private showers, this routine feels both efficient and strangely intimate. After bathing, the tub was emptied by hand. The water was poured outside or reused for plants if not too soapy. The tub was then wiped dry with a cloth and turned upside down to avoid mould. The used cloths were rinsed and hung discreetly near the kitchen or stove to dry. Nothing was left messy. The space returned to normal as if nothing had happened. Bathing was not done every day. On cold or rainy days, when firewood was scarce, women wiped themselves down with hot cloths instead. But on most evenings, even a quick wash was preferred. The clean feeling, even from a short rinse, helped mark the end of the workday. Children learned the process early. They helped carry buckets, wring cloths, and prepare the space. Girls were expected to understand how to heat water, mix it, and pour it safely by the time they were 10. No one gave lessons. They just watched and copied. There's something admirable in how much care was put into such a modest task. It wasn't glamorous, but it was done with pride. There were no towels. After bathing, women used the same cloth to pat themselves dry. Hair was tied up if it had gotten wet. Clothes were put on quickly to keep warm. Then they returned to the kitchen to finish any remaining tasks or sit with the family for the evening meal. Even in richer households, the routine did not differ much. Some had slightly larger tubs, and a few added dried orange peels or herbal mixtures for fragrance. But the basics remained the same: hot water, rice bran, and a wooden tub. Cleanliness was expected, but no one praised you for it. It was just part of being a woman in a proper household. When visitors came, bathing was scheduled carefully to avoid being seen. The clothes and buckets were kept out of sight. No one spoke about it. It wasn't a secret, but it wasn't something discussed. By the time the bath was done, the room would be filled with the smell of wet wood and faint rice. The body would feel warm, the skin slightly rough from the bran. The air outside would already be dark. That moment, sitting quietly while tying her sash again, was often the first time all day a woman sat still without having to move. From here, the routine turned to hair care, where wooden combs and camellia oil kept long black strands neat through wind, heat, and long hours of work. By the time the body was clean and the wooden tub had been emptied, the hair still remained untouched, unlike face washing, which happened daily, or bathing, which could be quick and simple. Washing hair was a task of its own. It could not be rushed, and it certainly could not be done without preparation. That is why most Edo women only wash their hair every few days, usually 2 or 3, depending on the season, their household schedule, and how much water they could spare. It was not because they disliked the feeling of clean hair, but because clean hair came with a long process. Hot water was never readily available. It had to be heated on the stove using firewood or charcoal, carefully tended so the water did not boil over or cool too quickly. A large iron pot was set on the hearth in the late afternoon, often after the evening meal was cooked. The water would sit there until the woman could carry it to a small wash area, usually near the same place she bathed. This was not a designated room, just a quiet spot in the house with a cloth mat on the floor and a low stool. Next to the water pot would be a wooden basin, a cloth to wrap the hair, and a small bowl containing the washing material. There was no shampoo. What they used depended on what was available. Most commonly, it was a handful of rice bran left over from milling, mixed with warm water into a soft paste. Some households also kept clean plant ash near the stove, sifted from burned wood and stored in a container with a lid. When mixed with water, the ash became slightly slippery, enough to help lift dirt from the scalp. On rare occasions, women crushed dried roots or stalks of herbs, such as sweet flag, known for producing a faint foam, The woman would kneel on the mat, tilt her head forward over the basin, and use a ladle to slowly pour warm water over her scalp. The first pour was done carefully to test the temperature. After the scalp was damp, she would dip her fingers into the rice bran paste and massage it into the roots of her hair, part by part. There were no brushes involved, only her hands. The mixture would coat the scalp and the upper part of the strands, and she would continue rubbing gently until she felt the oil and dust begin to lift. Washing your hair with ash and kitchen leftovers is about as luxurious as brushing your teeth with a tree branch. There was no strong smell. The rice bran had a faint, nutty scent. The ash had none. What mattered was that it worked. Once the scalp was cleaned, the hair was wrapped in a soft cloth to keep it from dripping while she waited. This waiting time was not measured with a clock. It was often just long enough to tidy up the space, check on the stove, or prepare clothes for the next day. The cloth kept the warmth in and allowed the paste to settle before rinsing. The rinsing step was slow and deliberate. Another basin of clean water, often now only lukewarm, was used to pour over the wrapped hair. The cloth would be unwrapped and the paste gently squeezed out by hand. Several rounds of rinsing were needed. The water would run cloudy at first, then gradually clear. There was no hairdryer, no towel is big enough to wrap the whole head. Instead, the woman would pat the scalp dry with a clean cloth and allow the hair to air dry near the stove or in a draft-free corner of the room. Hair was never left loose while wet. It was either braided loosely or wrapped again until it dried. Even in summer, walking around with wet hair was avoided. In winter, it was unthinkable. The risk of catching a cold was too high, and everyone in the house would notice. So the drying process was built into the evening routine. Women sat near the fire while preparing sewing or folding linen, allowing time and heat to do the work. Compared to today, when a button starts a dryer and 10 minutes later your hair is perfect, this slow method feels like an entirely different world. Once dry, the hair was combed with a boxwood comb, but that came later. First came oiling. Clean hair was prone to tangling and needed moisture to stay in place. A small amount of camellia oil, stored in a ceramic bottle or lacquered pot, was poured onto the palm and spread lightly through the hair. It added weight and shine, and more importantly, made the strands easier to manage. The oil was never overused. Too much would stain the pillow or the inner layer of the kimono. Women knew how to apply just enough. This was passed down by habit, not instruction. There was no mirror involved. The fingers and the feel of the scalp were enough. Once the oil was evenly distributed, the hair was ready to be combed and styled, a task saved for morning in most cases. Girls learned how to wash their hair by the time they were 10. They carried their buckets, mixed their bran, and tied their cloth wraps. Mothers did not give long speeches. They showed how it was done, once or twice, then watched their daughters repeat it. By the time a girl became a teenager, she was expected to care for her hair without help. The act of washing hair was not seen as personal pampering. It was simply something that had to be done. Like sweeping the floor or cleaning the hearth, it kept the house in order and the body presentable. Hair was noticed. A greasy scalp or tangled knot would not go ignored, even if no one said anything directly. I find it quietly impressive how something as demanding as hair care has become just another ordinary part of the week. There were no fixed days for hair washing. It depended on the household's needs. If it rained, or if firewood was running low, the wash could be delayed. If there was a special event, like a visit to the shrine or a guest arriving, then hair would be washed ahead of time. Flexibility was necessary. There was no schedule hung on a wall, only the sense of what needed to be done and when. The entire process, from heating the water to drying the hair, often took over an hour. But no one complained. It was part of life, like chopping vegetables or washing clothes. There was no praise for doing it. There was only the expectation that it be done right. After the hair was washed and oiled, it had to be kept that way, through daily combing with smooth wooden tools and careful tying that kept every strand in place. Once the hair was washed, dried, and lightly coated with oil, the work wasn't over. Maintaining that hair throughout the day required its routine. Every morning, usually right after washing her face and before putting on the outer kimono, a woman would take out her wooden comb and begin the quiet process of grooming. It didn't take long, but it was never rushed. The hair had to be prepared properly so it wouldn't tangle, collect dust, or fall into the food while cooking. The comb used wasn't just any comb, it was made from boxwood, hand-carved, polished, and sometimes passed down between generations. The teeth were smooth and evenly spaced, never too sharp or too wide. Before use, it was lightly rubbed with camellia oil, just enough to make the comb glide without pulling. The oil was stored in a small ceramic pot with a wooden lid, kept away from heat and light. It had no artificial scent, just a faint natural smell that faded quickly after being applied. The hair itself was long. Most women had hair that reached their backs, and some even let it grow past their waist. Cutting it short was rare and often discouraged. The morning combing began with untying the loose wrap from the night before. If any strands had come loose during sleep, they were smoothed gently with the hand. Then the comb was run slowly from top to bottom, starting at the crown and moving toward the ends. If knots were felt, the hand was used first before the comb continued. Combing without oil was like trying to clean a floor with a dry rag. It dragged, pulled, and made everything worse. There was no mirror for most. Women combed by feel, by habit. They knew the direction their hair naturally fell. They understood where it parted and how much pressure the comb could take without snapping. The act itself was silent. Sometimes it was done sitting on the porch if the morning was warm. Other times it was done beside the kitchen while waiting for rice to cook. It was a pause between tasks, a moment of focus that belonged only to the person holding the comb. The oil served more than one purpose. It helped the hair stay smooth and manageable. It also created a slight barrier against dust and smoke. Most homes used open fires for cooking. That meant there was always a bit of ash in the air, especially in winter. A thin coat of oil kept the strands from becoming dry and brittle. It also added a natural weight to the hair, preventing it from flying loose in the wind. Once the hair was combed and evenly oiled, it was tied up. The style depended on age and situation. Younger women often pulled their hair into a tight knot at the back of the head. Married women or older relatives might fold it into a coil and secure it with cloth or wooden pins. The goal wasn't decoration, it was cleanliness and function. Loose hair was not practical. It fell into the face, stuck to sweat, and caught bits of lint or food. When you think of the dozens of hair products available today, sprays, gels, conditioners, it makes this one comb, one oil method look almost too simple. The combs were treated with care. After use, they were wiped with a clean cloth and stored in a small fabric pouch. They were never left out, never shared casually. If the teeth broke, they were repaired with glue or, in some cases, replaced entirely. But a good comb, if maintained, could last for decades. Some women had a separate comb just for applying oil, with wider teeth. Others used only one for everything. Even children were taught early how to use their small combs. At first, mothers would do it for them, gently detangling the fine strands and tying them up in simple styles. But by the age of 7 or 8, a girl was expected to begin combing on her own. Her strokes weren't perfect, and her knots were often loose. But the habit was what mattered. Clean, tied-up hair was part of being raised properly. Letting it hang wild was seen as a sign of neglect, both by the child and by the parent. The oiling wasn't done heavily, just enough to leave a slight sheen. Too much oil would stain clothing, especially the inner kimono collar, which was hard to wash. Women developed a sense for how much oil was too much. They would rub it between their fingers first, then pass their hands through the hair before using the comb to spread it evenly. The scent faded quickly, and there was no intention of making the hair fragrant. That wasn't the goal. The goal was control. I've always liked the idea of starting each day with a small, quiet task like this. It's steadying, not rushed, and done just for you. The time spent combing varied. Some finished in 5 minutes, others, especially those with very thick or long hair, took longer, but it was never done while walking or talking. You stopped what you were doing and sat down, even if only for a short while. There was no multitasking. You focused, combed, tied, and then moved on. Combing wasn't only about tidiness, it helped with comfort throughout the day. Properly tied hair stayed cooler in summer and warmer in winter. It kept sweat from dripping into the eyes and kept the neck from itching. During physical work, like washing clothes or scrubbing floors, the hairstyle didn't fall apart. It held. That reliability mattered more than appearance. Special occasions called for more elaborate tying, but the daily routine remained simple, clean, oiled, tied. The comb was put away, and the woman moved on to her other responsibilities. If the wind came strongly later in the day, or if the house became smoky from the hearth, she might redo it briefly. But most days, once in the morning was enough. Before the next full bath, and before the hair needed rewashing, the body still required daily attention, done not with soap or steam, but with a cloth soaked in warm water, wiped over skin in quiet corners of the house. Even though evening baths were common, they weren't always possible. Firewood wasn't endless, water wasn't always warm enough, and sometimes the day simply left no time for preparing the wooden tub. On those days, and especially in the colder seasons, women turned to a quieter and more convenient method, wiping the body with a warm cloth. This simple routine, often done in the early morning or before bed, became the in-between step that helped maintain personal hygiene without the effort of a full bath. The cloth used was made of linen or soft cotton, always clean and usually kept in a wooden drawer near the kitchen or by the hearth. It wasn't large, just enough to fit across the palm when folded. Before use, a pot of water was heated on the stove. Not boiling, just hot enough to create light steam. The cloth was dipped in, wrung out carefully, and then folded again before being taken to a quiet part of the house. There was no special room for this. Sometimes it was done behind a screen, sometimes beside the hearth where the light and warmth made things easier. The woman would sit on a low stool, remove her outer layer, and begin wiping the skin, one section at a time. The neck came first, then the collarbone, underarms, arms, chest, back, and lower body. Each part was wiped gently but thoroughly. Calling this a bath would be like calling a teaspoon of water a flood. The areas focused on most were the ones that collected the most sweat: the neck, armpits, and back. These were not places often exposed to air during the day, so cleaning them regularly helped prevent odour and discomfort. In summer, the cloth might be used again in the afternoon after working outside. In winter, it often replaced the bath entirely. The cloth was rinsed and wrung out between each section. Some women kept 2 or 3 cloths for this purpose, especially if others in the household were also using the method. The clothes were never shared between people. Everyone had their own, marked by a sewn corner or dyed pattern. After use, the clothes were washed by hand and dried near the stove or outside in the sun, depending on the weather. There were no perfumes involved. Sometimes a few leaves were added to the water, like dried chrysanthemum or mugwort, but that was optional. Most of the time, it was just clean water and a well-used cloth. The warmth helped loosen sweat and dust. The wiping motion helped wake up the body and left the skin feeling fresh. It reminds me of how, even today, people use face wipes and call it skincare, just with a bit more plastic and a lot more packaging. In the coldest months, this method became essential. Heating enough water to bathe was difficult. The floors were cold, the wind slipped through the paper doors, and the idea of undressing completely was unpleasant. A quick cloth wipe, done while still partially dressed and near a heat source, made more sense. Women would prepare the cloth, warm their hands first, and clean only what was necessary. The rest could wait. This wasn't seen as cutting corners. It was practical. A well-maintained cloth routine was still considered clean, even without full immersion. It showed discipline. It required quiet effort and regularity. Skipping it entirely would feel strange, like going to bed without removing your outer robe or forgetting to tie your sash properly. Children were taught this habit early. Young girls were shown how to heat the water, test its temperature with the back of the hand, and fold the cloth to avoid dripping. Mothers did not stand over them with instruction. They simply did it themselves, in full view, until the girl began doing it too. By age 7 or 8, most girls could manage their morning wipe. The cloth was never used cold. Even in summer, warm water was preferred. It opened the pores and felt more comforting. A cold cloth was for emergencies or punishment, not daily use. The warmth mattered more than people realised. It made a small routine feel purposeful. I find it strangely thoughtful that they chose warmth and patience over speed, even when the tools were so limited. On some days, this cloth cleaning was paired with a quick foot soak or a hand rinse. A separate basin was set aside for that. Women who had worked outside in sandals or picked vegetables in the garden often needed to clean their feet more thoroughly. But the same principles applied: no waste, no rushing, and always with care. Men in the household followed a similar method, but often less frequently, and with less attention to detail. For women, cleanliness was part of reputation. A wife or daughter who appeared dishevelled reflected poorly on the home. Even a servant girl was expected to look neat. So wiping the body each morning wasn't only about feeling fresh, it was about responsibility. The cloth itself mattered. It had to be soft but durable. Too thin, and it would tear after a few washes. Too thick, and it wouldn't dry in time. Most women had 2 or 3 cloths in rotation. Some were made from old clothing, repurposed after years of use. The edges were sewn to prevent fraying. Nothing was wasted. Even the water, once cooled, was sometimes used to rinse floors or water the garden. There were no rules written anywhere, no schedule, just a habit, passed down quietly. You woke up, you washed your face, you wiped your body, and only then did the day begin. No one asked if you had done it. They could tell. The way you moved, the way your collar sat, the way your hands looked. These were signs. Once finished, the cloth was hung neatly to dry, and the basin was emptied outside. The smell of warm linen and steam mixed with the scent of rice being cooked, or miso being stirred. The house was alive, and yet the act of wiping the skin was silent, private, and always done with the same steady pace. After the wiping was done, the scent of the body still mattered, and for that, women turned to scented powders, herbal cloths, and careful layering of garments to keep fresh through long hours of quiet labour. Clean skin was only part of the daily routine. In a society where people lived close together, shared rooms, and wore layers of fabric even in the summer, scent mattered more than most would admit. Without deodorant, perfume bottles, or running water, Edo women relied on more practical methods to keep their bodies smelling pleasant. It wasn't just for beauty or elegance, it was a part of good manners. Being clean also meant smelling clean, even if no one ever said it out loud. One of the most common tools for this was a type of powdered scent. It wasn't purchased in a store or made in large quantities. It came from dried herbs, crushed roots, or orange peels left to harden, then ground by hand. These powders were kept in small ceramic containers with tight lids, placed in drawers, or wrapped in cloth. The smell wasn't strong. It didn't fill a room or announce itself, but when applied to the body or tucked into clothing, it lingered just enough to leave an impression. The powders were made at home or by local vendors. Dried mandarin peel was common, often mixed with clove or sandalwood, depending on what was available. Some women used powdered chrysanthemum petals or ground camphor bark. There were no strict recipes. The goal was to create a soft, dry powder that would not irritate the skin but would cover the faint scent of sweat, smoke, or oil. It was usually dusted onto a thin inner cloth, which was then wrapped around the underarms, chest, or lower back. Using ground orange peels as perfume is not quite the luxury spa treatment most people picture today. In wealthier households, there were small squares of scented fabric, cotton, or silk pieces that had been soaked in herbal mixtures and dried slowly. These clothes were folded and placed between layers of the kimono. usually between the undergarments and the first visible layer. They didn't just add fragrance. They helped absorb moisture, especially in the summer months when the heat was heavy and the fabric trapped every bit of body warmth. The placement of these clothes mattered. One behind the neck, one near the chest, and sometimes one at the waist. Each served a purpose. They didn't stain the fabric and were changed regularly. Some women even prepared a week's worth in advance, airing them out in the sun each morning and storing them in covered boxes. The scent faded slowly throughout the day, but was enough to maintain a clean presence during daily work or formal visits. In rural areas or among those who could not afford dried herbs, some women used fresh leaves tucked into their sash or collar. Mint, shiso, or mugwort were easy to grow and added a cooling effect when rubbed on the skin. These weren't as long-lasting as powders, but they served well enough. The women would replace the leaves during midday breaks, often in silence, sometimes while tending to household chores. The scent wasn't for attracting attention. It wasn't for impressing men or standing out. It was about composure. Clean scent meant self-control. It meant the woman had taken time to care for her body even in a small, quiet way. There was no praise for smelling pleasant, but there would certainly be quiet judgment for those who didn't. Today, most people rely on one bottle of spray to do what took careful layering, mixing, and daily maintenance in the past. Some clothes were passed down through families. A woman might inherit a sachet case or scent pouch from her grandmother. These weren't used every day. They were reserved for the new year, festivals, or weddings. They had embroidery or painted symbols and were kept in lacquer boxes between uses. The herbs inside were refreshed every season. There was no expiration date, only the quiet ritual of refilling and folding. Children were introduced to these practices gradually. They watched their mothers prepare the scented cloths or crush the herbs with a stone. By the time a girl entered her teenage years, she had her small pouch or container. It wasn't a gift ceremony. It simply appeared one day, slipped into her drawer, with no announcement. From then on, she was expected to use it as needed. The scent was always subtle. If someone could smell it from across the room, it was considered excessive. That wasn't the goal. A faint, clean note when bending forward or reaching across the table was enough. It said the woman was attentive, disciplined, and respectable, not extravagant. What I like about this practice is how quiet it was. There was no showing off, no labels, just the thoughtfulness of staying fresh without needing to explain why. These powders and cloths were also used to mask other smells. The smell of fish from the kitchen, of smoke from the hearth, or of damp cloth in the rainy season. Some women even tucked paper strips, infused with crushed herbs, into the folds of their sleeves or into their headscarves. These were often replaced and burned once they became stale. Nothing was thrown into the street or left lying around. There was no perfume market, no trend. The materials came from what was around them. Drying herbs took time. Crushing them by hand took effort. Preparing the clothes wasn't fast, but each woman built a system that matched her body, her home, and her daily movements. It didn't require much space, only attention. Even in poor homes, the effort was there. Maybe not every day, but before important events or gatherings. No one wanted to arrive somewhere smelling like old rice or wet fabric. The lack of resources didn't erase the value of cleanliness. It just changed the form. After placing the powders and scented cloths in position, the woman dressed carefully, adjusting each layer so the scent would stay close to the skin. Once the outer robe was tied, the smell was barely noticeable, but she would carry it all day, not for anyone else, but because that was how things were done properly. From the care of scent, the focus shifted to the mouth, where small sticks and black powders kept the breath clean and the teeth quietly polished. Among all the daily hygiene habits in Edo households, tooth cleaning was perhaps the quietest. It didn't take up much space, it didn't require any tools that couldn't fit into a small pouch, and it rarely involved water. But it was a habit that started early and continued daily. especially in homes where discipline was expected in every detail, even the invisible ones. There were no toothbrushes made of plastic or with bristles. Instead, women used small wooden sticks, often carved from soft branches or bamboo. The end of each stick was chewed until it frayed slightly, becoming soft and flexible like a tiny brush. These sticks were prepared at home or bought in small bundles from street vendors. They were easy to carry, didn't cost much, and could be made fresh whenever needed. The brushing routine usually happened in the morning, after face washing and before breakfast. A small dish of charcoal powder was taken from a covered bowl. The charcoal was made from burned bamboo, crushed finely by hand using a mortar and pestle. It was black, odourless, and slightly gritty. Some families added a pinch of sea salt to the mixture, not for taste, but to enhance the scrubbing. The salt also helped preserve the powder in humid weather. The stick was dipped into water first, then tapped lightly into the powder until the tip was dark. Then the woman would bring it to her teeth and begin brushing. There was no mirror, no toothpaste foam, and no flavour. Just a slow, steady movement over each tooth, front and back. The brushing was done gently, with more attention to consistency than pressure. Calling this a breath-freshening routine would be like calling a whisper a performance. The black powder left a film on the lips and tongue. But after brushing, the mouth was rinsed with tea or herbal water. Mint leaves boiled in water were preferred when available, but often plain green tea was used. The rinse wasn't just to remove residue, it also helped reduce odour and left a clean, slightly bitter aftertaste that felt refreshing. The liquid was swirled in the mouth for several seconds, then spat outside or into a bowl. There was no spitting into sinks or toilets. Those things didn't exist. Some women carried their stick and powder in a cloth pouch when travelling, after a long walk, or before entering someone else's home. A quick brushing could be done behind a tree or in a corner. It wasn't about appearance. It was about showing self-respect. No one commented on whether someone's teeth were perfectly white, but bad breath or neglected hygiene would quickly become the subject of quiet judgment. The charcoal didn't whiten teeth, but it helped reduce build-up and stains from miso, tea, and smoking. Teeth were rarely perfect. Some were crooked, others darkened with age, but they were expected to be clean. That meant no visible build-up, no loose food, and no strong smell when speaking. Even if a woman didn't speak much in public, her breath still mattered to those close to her. Family members, guests, or employers all noticed these things. Today's shelves are full of mint gels, whitening strips, and tongue scrapers, making this little stick and powder method feel like something from a different planet. The toothsticks were used until they wore out, then thrown into the fire or into the garden. There was no waste. Some women had a habit of carving a small groove near the end of the stick so they could hang it on a hook or tie it with a string. These were small details, but they kept the stick clean and ready to use. Children often used shorter sticks, easier to hold with small hands, and were taught to chew the ends properly to create the brushing tip. Mothers taught daughters this habit by repetition. They didn't lecture about dental health or explain bacteria. They simply brushed each morning in full view, and the child learned to do the same. By the time she was 10, a girl was expected to keep her stick clean, prepare her powder, and rinse without being reminded. There was no concept of flossing. Food particles stuck between teeth were removed with fingers or a sliver of wood if needed. This was rare because meals were simple and rarely included sticky or processed foods. Most of what was eaten, like rice, vegetables, and broth, left a little residue, but if something stuck, it had to be removed quickly. No one went about the day with food in their teeth. That was considered careless. The powder itself was stored with care. Too much moisture ruined the texture. Most women kept it in a small lacquered container with a tight-fitting lid. It was never left open. If guests were in the house, the container was put away. Oral care, while routine, was not something done in front of others. It was private, and like many things in Edo households, it was handled quietly and without comment. I've always found this method oddly satisfying. It's not fancy, but it's efficient and surprisingly thoughtful. There were no sweeteners or artificial flavours in this routine. The goal wasn't to enjoy it. It was to keep the mouth clean and the body respectable. Even older women with missing teeth or worn enamel still kept their routine. A clean mouth was not only about health, it was about habit and presence. At night, some women brushed again before sleep, especially if they had eaten oily fish or stronger dishes. Others only did it once a day. The frequency varied, but the commitment didn't. The same tools, the same motions, the same result. Clean breath, clean tongue, prepared for the day ahead. Teeth were not expected to be perfect, but the mouth could not be ignored. In a world with no dental clinics, prevention was everything. This routine, even if simple, helped many avoid pain, infections, or social discomfort. It was small, but it mattered. After the mouth was cared for, there were still parts of the body that needed regular attention, and for that, some women turned to plucking or even burning fine body hair to keep their skin neat and proper. Once the mouth was rinsed and the teeth felt clean, there were still small details left to take care of. Among them was body hair. It wasn't talked about openly, and there was no strict rule on what had to be removed or left alone. But for many Edo women, hair on the arms, legs, or underarms was considered something to manage. Not because anyone would see it in public, but because keeping it in check made daily hygiene easier, and it was simply part of being neat. There were no razors, no creams or shaving tools. The most common method was plucking. A small pair of tweezers made from bamboo or sometimes thin strips of metal was kept in a cloth pouch along with a mirror and a sewing needle. These tweezers were about the length of a finger, flat at the tip, and smooth enough not to cut the skin. Some had slight curves, others were straight. They were made by hand and sharpened as needed. Hair removal wasn't done every day. It was a weekly habit for some, monthly for others. The task was often done in the evening when the house was quiet. A woman would sit near the hearth, using the soft firelight to see the fine hairs on her arms or legs. She plucked slowly, not rushing, pressing the tweezers close to the skin and pulling gently. Plucking each hair one by one is about as relaxing as shelling a sack of beans in silence. Most of the time, the focus was not on appearance. It was on maintenance. Long body hair trapped sweat, picked up dirt, and made wiping the skin more difficult. Removing it helped keep the body cleaner, especially in summer when layers of fabric pressed tightly against the skin. In winter, it was less of a priority, but many kept the habit anyway. The underarms received special attention. This area was prone to odour and difficult to keep dry, especially when moving around during chores. While most of the body stayed covered in public, women took care to clean and smooth these parts in private. Some believed that removing hair from the underarms reduced sweat, or at least helped the skin feel cooler during hot days. Aside from plucking, there was another method. A small strip of paper, sometimes soaked in oil or plant resin, was rolled tight and then lit on one end. The woman would wait until the flame had settled to a small glow, then quickly sweep it across the skin, singeing the fine hairs without touching the flesh. It required practice. If held too close, it burned. If too far, it did nothing. The goal was to catch the surface hairs without leaving a mark. This method was used mostly on the arms and lower legs. It was faster than plucking, but less precise. Some used it only before festivals or visits, when a smoother appearance was preferred under the layers of silk and cotton. Others avoided it entirely, fearing burns or the smell of smoke that lingered afterward. Compared to today's hair removal options, with electric trimmers, sugar wax kits, and laser clinics, this method feels more like handling a campfire than doing a beauty routine. There were no commercial products. Everything was handmade. The paper used for burning was cut from recycled sheets, folded tightly, and sometimes dipped in herbal water before drying. The tweezers were passed down or made locally. If they broke, they were repaired. Nothing was thrown away unless it was beyond saving. Some women used a warm cloth to open the pores before plucking. Others applied a bit of oil afterward to soothe the skin. Camellia oil was often used for this, the same one used for hair. A few drops were rubbed into the skin using circular motions. There were no ointments or creams, just oil, cloth, and time. This grooming was not seen as indulgent. It was not for fashion or display. It was quiet, sometimes tedious, but it gave a sense of order. A clean body, a smoothed arm, a fresh layer of scent cloth under the robe. These were the marks of readiness, even if no one else noticed. Young girls were not expected to pluck their body hair, but they watched. As they reached their teens, they began to ask questions or imitate what they saw. The first pair of tweezers was not a gift. It was something handed down, casually, often with no words. A mother might leave it in her daughter's drawer, and from that point on, it became hers. The amount of hair removed varied. Some women focused only on the forearms and underarms. Others included the lower legs, especially in warmer months. Facial hair, if visible, was sometimes plucked as well. The goal was not perfection, it was control. Letting the hair grow without care was seen as a sign of laziness. Taking the time to remove it was a mark of quiet self-respect. Something is steadying about these routines. They weren't loud, didn't demand attention, but they gave shape to each week. For women who worked outside, hair removal also had a practical purpose. Sweat collected easily in folded fabric, and removing body hair helped reduce itching or irritation. It also made it easier to apply scented powder or cloth, which would otherwise cling to the hair. These small things mattered when comfort was rare and daily work was hard. After the task was finished, the tweezers were cleaned with water and dried with a soft cloth. The burnt paper was crushed and thrown into the fire. The space was tidied, the oil container closed, and the clothes hung to air. There was no announcement, no mirror check, just a sense of completion. By morning, no one would comment on whether her arms looked different, but the woman would know. She had taken the time to do what needed to be done. It wasn't flashy, but it was enough. After smoothing the skin, some women turned to the most sensitive part of their hygiene routine, using warm herbal water to clean the area no one ever spoke about. Yet, everyone quietly managed. After body hair was carefully removed and the skin wiped with oil, attention turned to a part of the body that was rarely discussed aloud but never ignored. The intimate area, though hidden beneath layers of fabric, was cleaned regularly using warm water infused with herbs. There were no written instructions, no public conversations, and no products sold in shops. The method was passed quietly from mother to daughter, and it was followed without complaint or delay. The herbs used were simple, grown in gardens or gathered nearby. Shiso, mugwort, and chrysanthemum were the most common. These plants were believed to have calming and cleansing properties, not because of scientific evidence, but because generations of women had trusted them. A handful of leaves was placed in a clay pot, covered with water, and heated over a small flame until warm. The water was never boiled, just enough heat to draw out the scent and colour of the herbs. The pot was left to sit for a few minutes before use. The woman would then take a clean piece of cloth, dip it gently into the warm herbal water, and wring it out. The cloth was soft, usually linen or cotton, and used only for this purpose. She would squat over a wooden board or crouch in a quiet corner, then gently wipe the intimate area using slow, careful movements. There was no scrubbing, just gentle cleaning. Calling this a spa treatment would be like calling a whisper a sermon. The cloth was never reused without washing. After each use, it was rinsed with clean water, washed by hand with soap or ash, and then dried separately from other laundry. Some women had a small basket set aside just for these cloths, lined with paper or fabric. The clothes were never left visible to others, and were always dried in a discreet corner of the house. This practice was not done only during menstruation. Even outside of those days, many women cleaned the area every morning or evening, especially in summer when sweat built up under the layers of the kimono. In winter, it was done less frequently. but never ignored entirely. A warm herbal wipe provided both physical relief and peace of mind. During menstruation, the routine became more frequent. The cloth was used several times a day. The herbal water was changed often. Some women added extra herbs during this time, especially those with a stronger scent or slight bitterness. Mugwort was especially popular. It was believed to reduce itching and discomfort. Modern feminine washes with 10 ingredients and a plastic bottle would have seemed completely unnecessary next to a pot of warm herbal water and a clean cloth. There were no disposable wipes or commercial products. The idea of throwing something away after one use didn't exist. Everything was washed, dried, and reused. The clothes lasted for months, sometimes years, and were patched carefully when they began to wear out. A few women embroidered small marks onto the corners of their cloths to keep track of how long they had been used. The water was never reused. After wiping, the herbal water was poured into the soil outside or thrown into the cooking fire once cooled. Some women believed that the herbs should return to the ground after use. It was a quiet, respectful way of ending the process. Young girls were not taught this all at once. They began by helping to collect the herbs, then watched as their mothers prepared the water. When the time came, a cloth was handed to them. No speech was given, just a nod, a pot left in the corner, and a small piece of folded linen. From that day, the routine became their own. There was no shame in the practice, but it wasn't spoken about either. It was understood to be personal, not secret, but not public. No one asked another woman how often she cleaned. The answer was in how she moved, how confident she seemed, how carefully she kept her clothing. I think there's something respectful in the way this was handled. Nothing exaggerated, nothing ignored, just quiet care, done without words. In some areas, women used different herbs depending on the season. In the spring, new shiso leaves were preferred. In the fall, dried chrysanthemum petals were stored in jars. The scent of the herbal water filled the room for a moment but faded quickly. There was no perfume, only the smell of clean plants and steam rising from the surface of the pot. The clothes were always checked for wear. Any tear was sewn immediately. If the fabric became too thin, it was repurposed for cleaning other parts of the body. Nothing was wasted. Every square of fabric had a life cycle, from undergarment to rag, from wipe cloth to floor cloth. That flow was understood by every woman. Cleanliness was not about perfection. It was about discipline. A woman who cared for herself this way didn't need to explain anything. Her body was cared for in small ways, not seen but always felt. These routines were not decorative. They were essential. The pot used for boiling the herbs was also kept separate. It was not used for food. Some families had a small, blackened pot just for this purpose, stored under the sink or near the firewood pile. No one else touched it. It didn't need to be labelled. Everyone in the house knew what it was for. Menstruation was rarely discussed, but every woman understood how to care for herself during it. The herbal water, the cloth, and the private corner were all she needed. No one came to ask if she needed help. She didn't need to say anything. Her absence from work for a few minutes, the steam rising from a bowl, or the cloths hung behind the stove spoke for her. Once the body had been wiped clean and soothed, attention turned to the cloths themselves, folded in layers and tied carefully around the waist, washed and reused in a cycle that lasted for years. Once the body was carefully wiped with herbal water and the skin dried, there was still one part of the female routine that required constant preparation. Menstruation, though rarely mentioned in public, was a part of life that no woman could ignore. It arrived quietly, disrupted schedules, and made daily tasks more difficult, without disposable pads, medicine, or any sense of privacy built into the home. Edo women managed it with folded cloth, fabric ties, and a great deal of quiet discipline. The clothes were made from soft cotton or linen. They were cut into rectangles, washed many times to soften them, and folded into thick layered pads. These layers were designed to be absorbent but still thin enough to wear under several layers of clothing. The edges were hemmed by hand. either with tiny stitches or overlocked seams to keep them from fraying. Most women kept a set of 5 or 6, enough to rotate during one cycle. These clothes did not stay in place on their own. They were held with fabric belts or waist ties, made from cotton or hemp, about a hand's width across. The cloth was placed against the body, then the belt was wrapped around the hips and tied securely at the back or side. There was no adhesive, no button, no snap, just tension and placement. Wearing layered cloth with no elastic is about as secure as trying to hold a book closed with a single ribbon. During heavy days, the clothes had to be changed often. A woman would excuse herself quietly and go to the corner of the house or the outdoor toilet area, where she could untie the belt, fold the used cloth, and replace it. The used cloth was folded inward to hide the stain, placed into a small drawstring pouch, and carried discreetly back to the laundry area. These pouches were made from soft, dark-coloured fabric. They were washed with the cloths, but stored separately. Some women added a bit of scented leaf or dried orange peel inside the pouch to mask odour, though that was not always possible. The point was not to advertise or conceal menstruation, but simply to manage it without drawing attention. The used clothes were rinsed as soon as possible. Clean water was poured into a basin, and the cloths were soaked and rubbed until the water ran clear. Soap, if available, was used sparingly. The clothes were then washed again, wrung out, and hung to dry in an area where guests or men of the house would not see them. This was usually behind a kitchen curtain or near the back wall of the house, compared to disposable pads today, which come wrapped in plastic, sealed in boxes, and scented with chemicals. These plain folded cloths seem both humble and surprisingly reliable. There was no shame in menstruation, but there was no discussion either. Girls learned about it slowly, first by watching their mothers rinse cloths or prepare herbal water, then by receiving a small cloth bundle one day without much explanation. The first time was often confusing, but the routine settled in quickly. Within a year, the girl was washing her clothes, tying her belt, and managing her schedule. There was no time off for menstruation. Women worked through it, cooked through it, and did household labour as usual. If the pain was strong, she might rest longer in the morning or sit beside the stove more often, but no one stopped working because of it. The clothes had to be worn carefully. If tied too loosely, they shifted. If tied too tightly, they caused discomfort. Each woman learned how to adjust them based on her body and the day's needs. The layers of the kimono helped conceal everything. Even with a bulky cloth belt tied around the waist, the outer garments covered it completely. Movement was restricted somewhat, but women moved carefully during those days anyway. If there was leakage, the clothes were changed immediately, and the stained layers were soaked without delay. Cleanliness was not just about appearance, it was about health and dignity. Some women added extra padding on heavier days. They folded additional cloth into the main pad or added a second belt to hold it in place. At night, the clothes were changed just before sleep, and another set was kept nearby in case of waking early. There were no bed sheets to stain, only futon layers and woven mats, which were expensive and difficult to clean. Extra care was taken to avoid a mess. What I find most impressive is how women turned cloth, thread, and repetition into something dependable. It wasn't convenient, but it was effective. There were occasional accidents. A belt would come loose or a cloth would shift. In those moments, the woman would excuse herself and fix the problem quietly. No one pointed it out. No one commented. It was understood. Everyone had been there. After each cycle, the clothes were washed carefully, then aired in sunlight for a full day to dry and disinfect. They were folded and stored in a separate box, often wrapped in another layer of fabric. Some women embroidered small symbols or initials onto the corners to mark which clothes belonged to them. These items were never shared, not even between sisters. There were no calendars to track dates, but most women knew their own rhythm. They counted weeks, paid attention to changes in appetite or energy, and noticed signs in their body. It wasn't medical knowledge, but it was practical. When the signs came, they prepared the cloths, the pouch, and the belt without needing to say a word. The folded cloths lasted for years. When they began to thin or stain permanently, they were retired to use as rags or burned discreetly. New ones were made during quiet afternoons, when scraps of fabric were available. A good set of menstrual cloths was a part of every woman's drawer, even if it was never shown. With menstruation managed, the daily outfit itself played a role in hygiene, where layered kimono and regular changes of inner garments helped keep the body dry, clean, and presentable from morning to night. After the clothes were folded and put away, and the body felt fresh again, it was time to get dressed. For Edo women, clothing wasn't only about modesty or fashion, it was also a part of daily hygiene. The way garments were layered helped control sweat, protect the skin, and keep visible parts of the outfit looking presentable. Even in the heat of summer or the cold of winter, the number of layers wasn't simply a matter of style, it was a methodical way to stay clean without constantly bathing. Most women wore between 2 and 5 layers, depending on the season, the activity planned for the day, and the materials available. The innermost layer, usually made of lightweight cotton or linen, was the most important. It absorbed sweat from the back, chest, underarms, and collar. This layer was always worn directly on the skin and was the first to be changed when needed. Over that came one or more intermediate layers. These added structure, helped shape the body, and prevented the inner cloth from showing through. The final layer, the one most people saw, was thicker, sometimes patterned, and made from better fabric. It was the most visible part of the outfit, but also the one least likely to come into contact with the body directly. Wearing 5 layers of cloth just to keep your collar clean feels about as excessive as using 3 blankets just to avoid washing your pillowcase. The inner layers were washed regularly. In many homes, women had 2 or 3 sets of underlayers in rotation. These were washed by hand in warm water with ash or rice soap, hung to dry in the sun and folded neatly. Because they touched the skin directly, they wore out faster and had to be mended often. A torn seam or worn collar was repaired before it became noticeable. The outer layers, on the other hand, were cleaned less often. Some were washed only once a month or even less. Their job was to stay clean by never touching sweat, oil, or skin. That's why the layering system worked. The visible parts stayed neat as long as the underneath did its job. This allowed women to move through their day with confidence, knowing they looked proper without needing to wash every item daily. Getting dressed was a process. It took time. Each layer had to be adjusted so the seams lined up, the collars sat flat, and the folds didn't bunch under the sash. This care wasn't only for appearance. Misaligned layers could cause rubbing or discomfort, especially on hot days. A poorly tied belt or slipped hem made everything feel wrong, so women dressed slowly, checking each piece as they went. Compared to today's clothing, where a single shirt is expected to do everything, this layered method feels both excessive and strangely efficient. Younger women often wore fewer layers, especially while working. 2 or 3 garments were enough for cleaning, cooking, or running errands. But during formal occasions, or when visiting someone, they added more. More layers meant more polish, more care. It showed respect. Even servants and lower-class women followed this system. Though their fabrics were coarser and fewer in number, the layers also helped regulate temperature. In winter, adding extra cotton undergarments kept warmth in. In summer, loose layering allowed sweat to evaporate more gradually, reducing chafing. A damp inner layer could be swapped out midday without needing to change everything. This flexibility made daily life more manageable. Children were dressed the same way from a young age. By the time a girl turned 10, she knew how to fold her collar properly, how to choose the right underlayer, and how to remove the inner shirt without messing up the outer one. These things were not taught with words. They were learned by doing, watching, copying, repeating. Over time, it became muscle memory. What I admire most is how they use clothing not just for warmth or style, but as part of their entire hygiene system. It was protection, order, and modesty in fabric form. In some households, women kept separate sets for morning and evening. a clean inner garment was worn after the evening wipe down or bath. This cloth was usually plain and soft, chosen for comfort rather than looks. It allowed the body to rest without rubbing against heavy seams or stiff materials. The day's sweat was gone, and the fresh cloth marked a clean end to the day. Stains on outer clothing were avoided at all costs. If something spilled, the inner cloth caught it first. A woman wiping her child's nose, lifting a hot pot, or bending over to sweep the floor could do so without ruining her best robe. This separation made it easier to move through life while still maintaining an appearance of dignity. Each layer had its function, and none were decorative alone. The sashes, belts, and inner ties kept things in place. The soft collars were swapped when they became worn. Some women even carried an extra inner cloth when travelling, folded tightly in a pouch. If they needed to change unexpectedly, they had what they needed. Laundry day was organised around these layers. The inner garments were scrubbed and dried first, then the underrobes, if needed. The outer layers were spot cleaned with care or hung to air out after being brushed with a soft cloth. Nothing was rushed. Clothing was folded the same way each time and stored in layers so the order of wear could begin again the next morning. As they moved through daily life, women adjusted their garments without thinking. A shift of the belt here, a tug at the sleeve there. It kept everything in place. Their bodies stayed dry, their collars stayed white, and their movements remained graceful. Not because it was easy, but because the system was built to support that result. Below the layers, one more item was changed with great regularity. The socks, made of white cloth, had to be kept spotless in a world where feet rarely stayed still and floors were never truly clean. Once the body was clean and the inner garments had been adjusted, the feet were the final detail before stepping out to begin the day. In Edo households, women wore socks every day, even inside the home. These were not just for warmth or appearance. They served a clear hygienic purpose. The socks, known as tabi, were made from soft white fabric, and because they touched both the floor and the skin directly, they were always at risk of becoming soiled. Tabi were sewn to fit the shape of the foot, with a split between the big toe and the rest, allowing them to be worn with wooden sandals. The white fabric was clean when new, but after a single day of walking on wooden floors, carrying water, tending fires, and stepping outside for errands, the soles were often marked with dust, ash, or bits of straw. That is why most women wash them every evening without exception. Each pair of tabi was made from cotton or hemp, stitched by hand or bought from a local maker. The cloth was not thick, but it was durable enough to last through repeated washings. The socks had ties at the back or side to secure them in place. Women put them on as part of their morning dressing routine and removed them only before going to sleep. If guests were visiting, or if a formal visit was planned, a cleaner pair was sometimes kept aside to change into right before stepping out. Expecting white socks to stay white on wooden floors is like expecting a paper umbrella to survive a thunderstorm. There was no rotation system like modern wardrobes. Women owned only a few pairs, sometimes just two. One was worn while the other was being washed and dried. The daily washing was done by hand using soap made from ash and leftover oils, usually produced at home in small batches. A shallow wooden basin was filled with warm water, and the tabi was soaked first to loosen dirt. Then came the scrubbing. A small wooden or straw brush was used to work soap into the soles of the socks. The focus was not only on visible stains, but also on odour and bacteria. The washing was done slowly, with care taken not to tear the fabric. After scrubbing, the socks were rinsed in clean water and wrung out gently to avoid stretching. They were hung on a bamboo pole or line, usually in a shaded outdoor area or behind the house, where air could circulate freely. Direct sunlight was avoided when possible to prevent the white cloth from becoming yellowed or stiff. If rain came unexpectedly, the socks were moved indoors to hang near the kitchen or hearth, where warmth and smoke helped them dry overnight. Compared to machine-wash socks tossed into plastic bins, these tabi were handled with more care than some people treat silk scarves. Even inside the house, tabi were worn nearly all the time. The floors were swept daily, but dust and ash from the hearth could still cling to bare feet. Wearing socks prevented dirt from sticking to the soles and transferring to futon covers or clean clothes. In homes where multiple people lived together, wearing socks also showed a level of respect. It kept private skin from touching shared surfaces. Some women changed their socks more than once a day if needed. After working in the garden or carrying water in muddy weather, they might wash their feet and put on a fresh pair. Others kept a towel at the entrance to wipe their feet before re-entering. But the tabi were usually still changed that evening. There was no hard rule, just a shared understanding that socks were part of the hygiene routine, not an accessory. Young girls wore tabi from a young age. Their socks were sewn by hand in smaller sizes, often from scraps of older fabric. At first, mothers helped wash them. By the age of 8 or 9, girls were expected to scrub their own, especially if they dirtied them by playing or walking without sandals. It was considered part of learning how to care for oneself. Tabs were stored carefully when not in use.